Welcome to the word of the day. This is our second set of words. Our first word of this new set of vocabulary is analogy. All right, so an analogy. This is actually a literary term, but it is used more broadly than just in literature. The plural is analogies. It is a noun, and it means a similarity in some respects between things that are otherwise unlike. It also means an explanation of something by comparing it with something similar. So analogies, you might be thinking, this sounds like something I've heard of before. Analogies are actually very closely related to similes and to metaphors. An analogy is when you compare two things to make a point. Now, the difference with a simile and a metaphor is that analogies can be more similar than a simile and a metaphor. So analogies are often more literal or realistic than metaphors. For example, an analogy might be comparing slavery to mass incarceration. The connection is clearer. A metaphor might compare slavery to being a bird in a cage. See how that's so much like the two things are much more unlike at first. So analogies are much more literal than similes or metaphors. All right, so some connections with analogies. It does have synonyms. Some synonyms include a similarity, a parallel, a likeness, a resemblance. Also correlation and equivalence. Antonyms are difference, dissimilarity, disagreement. There are curricular connections. This is a literary term. We're going to find lots of analogies this year, but Book 5 of the Odyssey ends with an analogy. So you'll see that. And then also in STEAM, let me see if I did this right. Nope, I didn't. In STEAM, analogies are found across art forms, and they're a powerful tool for artists to use to connect with their audience. Metaphors and similes are types of analogies, and I'm about to show you an analogy in art and an example of an analogy in film. So here are our examples. All right, so an example, a film version of an analogy is Ava DuVernay's documentary 13. If you've seen that, it's on Netflix. And in this film, she explores the connection between slavery and mass incarceration. That is an analogy. She's explaining the problems with mass incarceration by comparing it to something that we all know is awful, which is slavery. So that is a really great way for any type of artist to make a point and connect with an audience. Because some people might think, well, if you're in jail, you deserve to be in jail. But no one would hopefully think that, oh, well, people deserve to be enslaved. So when you make that analogy, then all of a sudden people understand your point of view. There's also this other example that I found near my house. If you are this, you might have noticed this. This is the Iffy Grocery off of Moreland and Wormwood. So this is a piece of street art. Someone painted this and put it up. And it says COVID-19 Trump 0. This art is making an analogy to compare Trump's response to the pandemic to a sports competition. So they made this looking like a scoreboard. I couldn't even think of the word. Looking like a scoreboard showing that the pandemic had more points than Trump had, that Trump was losing. His response to the pandemic was losing. So that's an analogy in art. And then you're going to be writing an analogy today, and I'm going to give you 3 options. You can write an analogy comparing virtual school to something. You can write an analogy thinking about Odysseus' situation at this point in the story, or you can write an analogy thinking about Penelope and Telemachus, their situation. So my example, an analogy of virtual school. Teaching virtual school reminds me of playing school as a child. I would line up all of my stuffed animals and stare at them while I taught a lesson. Now I feel like I'm just staring at my stuffed animals, but instead of stuffed animals, it's like your little faces on the Zoom screen. I feel just as disconnected, to you guys as I did back then, because obviously stuffed animals can't respond. Right? So that's my analogy. You'll get a chance to write one today. Once you start thinking about this, you'll probably notice these everywhere. They're all over the place. You'll see them a ton in advertising and in other things. Think if you can come up with an example you'd like to share. But once again, an analogy is a comparison, explaining something by comparing it to something else. That is our word of the day. I hope that your mind has expanded.